until dawn. It was the middle of the night, and the world outside the thin tent felt like it had been folded into a small, white box. Wind slammed into the canvas, and rain hissed like a million tiny teeth. The friends were crowded together, shivering, wrapped in sleeping bags and jackets that smelled of smoke and wet wool. Every breath fogged the inside of the tent. Every little sound, a branch striking the tent, the creak of a rope, grew into a giant noise that made hearts jump. Ben sat with his back pressed against the pole, eyes wide and bright in the dim headlamp glow. He listened hard, trying to make sense of a sound that had woken them all, a low, soft scraping that came from outside the tent, near the edge of the small clearing. At first they thought it was the storm moving the branches, or a rock rolling down the slope. Then it came again, a slow, careful scraping, as if someone dragged a bare hand across the snow. "Probably a tree," Mark said, his voice small. He pulled his hat down over his ears. "Probably just a branch." But Ben did not believe it. He was the one who grew up hiking the mountains with his dad. He could read a forest like a book. He squinted out into the dark where the tent's fabric sagged from the wind. "That's not a branch," he said. "That's something walking." "Don't go out, Ben," Hannah whispered. Her teeth chattered. "We can't. Not in that storm." Ben stood. He moved with the quick, certain steps of someone who wanted to prove he was brave. "I'll only look," he said. "I'll take the headlamp. I'll be right back." He smiled like it was a small adventure. The others wanted to argue, but the storm had made them tired and thin. Words were heavy, and hugging the small heat of the group felt safer than shouting. Outside the tent the world was white and flat and loud. Snow hit Ben's face and tasted like tin. The headlamp made a tunnel of light that cut through the snow, but the wind dissolved everything beyond a few feet. Ben held his lamp up and called softly into the dark. "Hello? Who's there?" There was the sound again, the scraping, closer now, and under it, like under water, a faint dragging as if something with weight had been moved slowly across the ground. Ben took a step forward. His foot sank, and the snow swallowed it. He took another step and suddenly the lamp went funny, the light wavered and stretched. For a second the world blinked and the sound stopped. Ben frowned and shouted into the storm. "Come on! Stop playing games!" Then, very close, something answered. It was not a voice he knew. It was like someone trying to say his name through a pillow. "Ben!" it whispered, thin and small and wrong. The word came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ben's mouth opened, but he didn't remember walking back toward the tent. He didn't remember the cold tightening around his hands. He just knew a small, terrible pull that led him away. Inside the tent, the others heard him call their names, only it didn't sound like Ben. The sound was far and close at the same time, like the echo of a memory. Hannah grabbed for the zipper. "Ben! Ben, no!" she cried. Mark fumbled, fingers numb and clumsy. The storm hit the tent so hard it bowed, making the speakers' voices bend. Lucy, who slept light, sat up and listened, her face pale. They heard Ben's footstep crunch once, twice, then the sound of the canvas door opening. A blast of cold poured in and blew the little lamp out. In the dark something moved outside the tent and then, silence, like a lid closing. They waited a breathless moment, thinking he would appear, shake snow from his shoulders and laugh. But Ben did not come back. The scraping sound came again, farther away now, and then nothing but the storm and their own breathing. They unzipped and looked out with lamps. All around was white and blank, and in the wavering light the ground showed two slow grooves in the snow. One set of footprints led away from the tent into the white, and then they looped in a small circle and came back toward the tent but stopped 10 feet away. There were no footprints beyond that. It was as if Ben had walked in a tight ring and simply vanished. Hannah screamed then, a high, thin sound, and the storm swallowed it. They shouted his name into that great white throat until the sound was hoarse. They stumbled out in the storm, hands numbed and raw, looking for one warm, moving body. Ben's flashlight lay on the ground, its beams spinning and dying slowly like a tired eye. They dug snow with their hands until their nails went numb. They yelled, they cried, they clung together for warmth and hope. But the hole they made was small and cold and empty. The wind only answered by swallowing their words and carrying them off into the mountain. And so the terrible waiting began, the waiting that fits the story's name like a glove. Until dawn. They would wait until the first gray light came and hope that Ben would be found. That hope is thin against the storm, but it is what people hold when the world seems to twist into fear. Before the storm, before the scraping and the footprints, before Ben walked out and circled the earth as if in a trance, the trip had been simple and bright. The 5 friends had planned the San Juan weekend for months. They wanted to escape the city's heat and noise, to sleep under black skies and wake to mountains that took their breath away. Ben and Mark had met at college. Hannah and Lucy were cousins. Jonas was Ben's coworker who loved to tell ghost stories by the campfire. They all worked hard and lived fast, and this trip felt like a small, honest thing. Tents, mugs of coffee, a remote trail no longer crowded by tourists. They drove up on Friday, all laughter and gear piled into 2 cars. The road that led into the mountains narrowed like a ribbon, and the world outside their windows turned from brown to green to white patches of snow that clung to the pines. They reached the trailhead in early afternoon and hiked in, their steps steady and strong. The mountains were kind that day, clear blue, with the sun sitting on the shoulder of a cold wind. They stopped by a creek and ate sandwiches, and Ben joked that he could live forever in that place if someone fed him stew. They found a small clearing near an old line of trees and decided to set the camp there. Ben built a small lean-to for wood and put up a bright tarp to block the wind. They traded jokes while the fire popped and sizzled. Hannah took pictures of the light through the pines, and Lucy collected a handful of smooth stones to lay as markers around their sleeping spots. The night came cold but beautiful, and they sat in a circle sipping something hot and sweet, watching stars prick the sky. Jonas told a story about a lost hunter who walked in circles until dawn and never found his way home. They laughed at it and pushed it away. The joke seemed harmless then. At dinner, a red bird landed on a nearby branch and seemed to look right at them. Ben reached out a finger and it hopped onto his glove like a small blessing. He smiled with a warmth that made the others glad. They tightened their jackets and zipped their tents, telling each other the plan: stay together, keep the fire going, check the weather in the morning and follow the trail markers. They were careful people, logical, kind, and they believed in plans. But the weather changed fast in those mountains. By midnight the breeze had become a wind, and the wind called the clouds together like neighbors gathering for a secret. The forecast had said, chances of snow. But that brief sentence did not hold the power that a storm can have. It did not know how quickly nights can become white walls that swallow directions. When the first big gust hit, their tent walls shook and the fire sputtered out. They brought their sleeping bags inside and joked that they would get up early to hike out. No one said what they were really thinking. The storm tightened around them with the sound of many small hands clapping. Phone signals blinked out like candles blown. The path markers, bright with fresh ribbons in the afternoon, bent under the snow and became invisible. The wind stole the smell of pine and replaced it with the taste of metal in their mouths. They ate cold food and tried to drift into sleep. That's when they heard something, a careful, patient scraping that did not belong to the wind. At first the sound was strange and dismissible. But it did not go away. It came again and again, circling the edge of their little clearing like someone reading the names on a list. It waited at the tree lean and then moved around to the side they had left open for the breeze. Ben, who loved the dark and the wild, went out to see. He stepped into a world that had been changed into a single color and a single sound. He walked into white without looking back. The calm after that first shock lasted a small time. They did what the scared do, they tried to make sense. They told each other stories of lost hikers returned, of mistakes they could fix. They shoveled snow to make a windbreak. They whispered names like prayers. They believed the sun would rise and the truth would come with it. But hope is a small, thin thing in a storm. It grows tiny and quiet until you think you can carry it in your palm. The night stretched long and the cold crept in. Their lamp batteries drained faster than they expected. The wind carved new shapes in the snow that looked like letters. Ben's lamp spun and died. His footprints made circles and then stopped. And then, long before dawn, they heard it, the sound that was not wind and not animal and not human, a little, soft voice calling someone's name. It said, "Ben!" But it did not sound like Ben. It sounded like the snow itself had learned to speak. They heard the voice and watched the place where the light from the tent door had been vanish into white, and in that vanishing they felt the story change. Waiting, they realized, is not just time passing. Waiting is a kind of pressure that pushes at your chest and makes small things matter more than they should. Until dawn, they would hold the pressure together, and hope would be the only thing between them and the cold that wanted to take everything. They wrapped themselves in blankets and waited. They whispered plans into the dark. "If he doesn't come back by the first light, we hike out." And then they counted breaths. The storm did not answer. The mountain kept its secret, and the scraping sound circled near the trees until the night became very still. Then, just when their souls were thin with fear and tiredness, the tent flap moved as if someone had breathed on it. A small, soft rubbing sound like paper on wood came from the snow and the tree line. The friends held their breath. Something was at the edge of the light. The story, and their lives, hung on that small, trembling moment. And then, the scraping stopped, as if whatever made the sound had listened, and the world waited to see what would happen next. The tent flap had lifted, a small mouth of white in the long night, and the scraping had stopped as if whatever had been listening had heard the small human heart beat inside. They waited, holding one another, while the storm knocked the world into pieces outside. Dawn felt like a lie that night, a promise that might not come. When the first thin gray light finally seeped through the canvas, it looked too small for the vast white around them. They unzipped as if waking from a long, wrong dream. The light made the snow a glassy flat, and their breaths made small clouds. They stepped out carefully, lamps in hand, searching for the bright shape of Ben. His headlamp lay in the snow, half buried, still blinking like a tired eye. Beyond it, his footprints arced away in a tight circle and stopped 10 feet from the tent, and then nothing. It was as if the world had swallowed him. "We call for help," Mark said. His voice was thin. They wrapped scarves around their mouths and began to walk the trail, calling Ben's name over and over until their voices felt raw. Each call came back faint and wind-bent. They walked until their legs ached and the path markers vanished into new drifts. The forest around them held its breaths like a living thing. They found small things: Ben's glove snagged on a twig, a flattened patch of snow where his body had rested, a single footprint that led away and returned in a small loop. They found nothing that made sense. The mountains seemed to rearrange themselves, erasing directions. Panic made them clumsy and loud, and their shouts carried until the cliffs swallowed them. When night fell again, they huddled in the tent, 2 people clinging to the others, and tried to stay warm. They told stories to keep their minds busy. Jonas, who had spent the day mapping the trail with a stick, said, "We'll follow the creek in the morning. Water goes down, it will lead us out." It was a plan they chose because it was simple and felt true. Morning came, gray and bitter. They wrapped in what they had and followed the thin water that ran under hard snow, its small voice promising a way. The wind stung their faces and turned their tepid courage into small, stiff motions. Hours passed and the world remained the same white. At noon, Mark slipped on a hidden rock and fell, his breath fading into a fog. He lay stunned for a moment, and when he lifted his face, the sky held a new shape, a dark smear on the snow, like someone had scrawled with coal. It was a circle of prints, many tiny circles that overlapped into a pattern. He traced it with his gloved finger and felt dread spread like cold under skin. They kept moving until their legs would no longer listen. By late afternoon, their fingers had gone numb and faces had gone pale in the way snow does. They found a fallen tree and sat beneath it for a while, letting the small shelter take their shock. They shouted and listened and shouted again. The mountain did not answer. At dusk, exhausted and near impossible to keep moving, they buried Mark's glove in the snow and decided to wait there, to rest a little, and then to go on when the moon rose. On the second morning, a voice called from the ridge, a rescue team, small against the white. The sound rolled down like a blessing. People in orange jackets came, faces wind-bitten and steady, asking questions in short, efficient sentences. They wrapped the friends in blankets that smelled like new plastic and gave them hot drink that burned but warmed. The rescuers moved with practiced calm, measuring the world in footprints and in the way snow lay. When they learned Ben was missing, their faces folded into the map of an old worry. Search parties fanned out with trackers and dogs, boots trumping the hush of snow. Helicopters came when the weather allowed, blue flashes above the trees that looked like tiny birds. The dogs worked with noses that belonged to a different kind of knowing, and sometimes they strained toward a place and then stopped, uneasy. On the second day, a rescuer called the others over in a voice that was both hard and soft. They found Ben less than half a mile from the camp, lying curled under a low pine, face turned to the sky. He was cold, and his skin had the pale glass of someone who had dreamed too long under snow. Around him the ground showed the strange pattern again, a small ring of prints that threaded into each other, as if someone had been pacing while speaking to himself. The medic checked him gently, fingers quick and careful. In those minutes that felt like an island, they tried to warm him with blankets and a small heater in a rescue sled. Ben's chest moved, faint and thin, and then it stopped. People who saw him afterwards said that he looked like someone who had finally fallen asleep after a very long, hard journey. The investigators said it was hypothermia and disorientation, snow blindness making the world a white wall, the cold stealing choice. They wrote clean reports and circled boxes and spoke with gravity. They said the most likely thing was a tragic accident, a man stepping out to check a noise and stepping into a storm that closed around him. It was the simplest answer and the one that felt like it fit the measured world. But the friends did not find the simplest answer comforting. They had seen the tracks, the circle prints, the way Ben's footprints came back close to the tent as if he had been near, and then somehow vanished from the line of steps. Rescue workers noted those oddities and took photographs. But when they looked closely, some of the pictures showed strange smears near the prints, like the snow had been pressed by something with fingers rather than feet. They called them anomalies and moved on, because there are only so many ways to explain a cold mountain and a human life taken. In the days after, when the survivors were flown down the narrow road and given clean clothes and hot rooms, the mountain became a story in the papers. People said the right words. Tragic freak storm, our hearts go out. The friends sat in a small hospital room with cups of tea and tried to drink without thinking of the cold. The wind felt far away there, an old sound from another life. But small things kept intruding. A photo taken by a rescuer showing Ben's footprints crossing one another like a loop, and in the loop the faint impression of something like fingers pressed into the snow. Or a piece of ice shaped oddly, like a small hand, found tucked under the pine where his body lay. When they finally returned to the city, people who read the story asked questions, about gear, about choice, about weather. The answers were clinical and cautious. But for the friends, the memory had a different shape. They remembered the voice that had whispered Ben's name, thin and wrong, and the way he had looked at them before he stepped into the white, his smile thin with adventure. They remembered the ring of prints, how the snow had a handwriting all its own. Weeks later, Mark could not sleep. He would wake at 3 a.m. and see the tent flap move in the dark room behind his closed eyes. He began to have dreams that were small and banal, like the mountain itself had learned to mimic ordinary life. A neighbor calling his name, a faucet dripping, footsteps in the hall. In the dream someone would stand outside his window and tap a slow rhythm like a knuckle on glass. Each dream ended the same way, with a whisper he could not place. He would wake with his hands curled and throat tight, and he would find his own bedroom window steamed over on the inside like breath on glass. Hannah took to walking at night, despite the way the city lights bothered her. One evening she passed the park and saw a circle of children's footprints around a play table, where frost had etched the shapes of small hands. She stopped cold, remembering how Ben had walked in a circle and the small prints that looked less like feet than like palms. That same week Lucy found a scrap of white fabric caught on a twig near her apartment. She knew at once it was part of Ben's scarf. How it had traveled to town no one could say. A month after the rescue, a detective who had worked the initial call asked to speak with them again. He was careful and patient. He told them he had gone back over the evidence because there were details that didn't fit perfectly. He had a question that sat thin and sharp. Did any of them remember hearing other voices that night? Not Ben's, but faint things? When they thought about it, each of them could name a sound that had been wrong. A rustle like paper, a scraping like nails, small soft rituals of noise that did not belong to wind or animal. They thought they had told the story already, but speaking the sounds out loud made them larger. The detective listened and then, in a way that felt both kind and clinical, he showed them a photograph taken by a rescuer at the scene. It was a wide shot of the clearing where Ben had been found. At the far edge of the frame, a smear of blue light cut like a finger. It was faint, almost nothing, and the rescuers had not noticed it at the time. When the photograph was enlarged, something more showed, a thin, pale shape standing at the edge of the trees, not human enough to be a person, not bright enough to be a trick of the camera. The detective did not claim it was proof of anything. He only said quietly, "We don't have a good explanation." That night, as rain tapped the city windows, the friends sat together in a kitchen that smelled of lemon and old coffee. They spoke in the small long sentences people use when trying to stitch something back together. They wondered about Ben's last steps and about the ring of prints. They remembered the voice that called his name, and the way he smiled when he believed brave was simple. None of them wanted to believe there was a thing with hands walking the snow, but the evidence, the prints, the photograph, was a needle that kept pricking their skin. Then, in the seconds when the conversation lulled and the kettle sighed, the quiet in the kitchen changed. It filled with a soft, patient sound, a sound like fingers on a window, slow and deliberate. Their cups stopped mid-reach. The hairs on their arms lifted as if a small breeze had passed through the room. The old clock on the wall made a careful, ticking sound. On the back porch, the small lamp they had hung for the cat blinked once and then died. A single light from the street played across the glass, and for a tiny moment a smear of blue moved like a fish. The air felt colder. Hannah crept to the window and peered out. At first she saw only the street, wet and empty. Then, at the edge of the yard, in the hard light of a neighbor's street lamp, she saw a set of prints, small, round, like someone had pressed palms into the wet cement and walked away. She swallowed. Her voice was thin when she said, "They came home." Before anyone could say whether that was possible, their phones buzzed with a single message from an unknown number. It read 2 words. "Wait here." They all looked at one another, and somewhere in the quiet house a long, patient scraping sounded like a nail drawn across a board. The sound was close enough now to be felt in the bones. Their hearts beat like tiny drums. Outside, beyond the porch light and the city's hum, something moved in a measured way, a slow step that left no shadow. The scraping continued, drawing a circle that had no beginning and no end. The sound outside the house moved slowly, tracing a wide circle as if it were choosing the right place to stop. The 4 friends stood together in the kitchen, barely breathing. The message on all their phones, "Wait here," glowed like a command neither of them wanted to obey but somehow couldn't ignore. Then, as if someone flipped a hidden switch, the scraping sound stopped. The sudden silence felt heavier than the storm they'd survived in the mountains. Mark swallowed hard. "We can leave right now," he whispered. "Get in the car. Just go." But Hannah shook her head. "If it followed us from the mountains, what makes you think running will matter?" Lucy pressed her palms to her ears. "We didn't bring anything back. We didn't do anything wrong." Jonas looked toward the back door. "Maybe it's not here to hurt us." The porch light flickered again. Once. Twice. Then it went completely dark. A thin blue glow, faint but alive, rose from the yard, the same bluish shimmer they had seen in the snow months earlier. The same glow that had circled Ben. The same glow that had appeared in the rescue photo. But this time it wasn't drifting. This time it was moving toward them. All 4 stepped back from the window as the glow reached the porch and stopped. It didn't push forward. It didn't break the glass. It simply hovered there, humming soft like a weak heartbeat. Then they heard it, a whisper. Faint. Almost frightened. "Cold, too cold." Jonas's eyes widened. That's Ben's voice. No, Lucy whispered. It can't be him. He's gone. But the voice came again, clearer now, trembling like someone who had walked through darkness for too long. Don't leave me. Don't leave me alone. Hannah pressed her hand against her mouth. Ben didn't die angry, she said softly. He died scared. He died looking for us. The blue glow brightened, and for a brief second they saw a shape inside it, not a full figure, just a faint outline of a person curled in the snow. A memory more than a body. Then it shifted, beginning to fade. Wait, Hannah said suddenly. She stepped forward. Ben, we're here. We're listening. The glow stopped fading. It steadied. Then the voice, thin and cracking, whispered. It wasn't the storm. The room froze. Mark felt his stomach drop. What do you mean? Silence. Then, it was calling me. The blue light pulsed, and the entire kitchen flickered the same color. Every shadow stretched longer. The house creaked. Something beyond human memory inhaled deeply, the kind of breath the mountain takes before a storm. A new whisper joined Ben's. Low. Hollow. Older. Something that had lived long before them, and had waited long after. Not alone, not anymore. The friends stepped back. The glow thickened into a swirling mist. Two sets of prints formed on the porch, small, round, hand-shaped impressions pressing into the wood as if something invisible stood there. Then the blue light rose, not threatening, but final, and wrapped itself around the house like a soft wave. Ben's voice whispered one last time. Thank you, for not leaving me. And like frost warming under sunlight, the glow dissolved. Not gone, but released. The porch light blinked back to life. The scraping sound vanished. The night became only night again. The friends stood together, shaking but breathing. The kitchen felt warmer. Mark opened the back door a crack, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to feel the truth. Outside, the hand-shaped prints were already fading. The blue shimmer was gone. The yard was silent. Peaceful. Lucy finally asked the question that had been waiting in all of them. Do you think that was really Ben? Jonas wiped his eyes. I think whatever found him out there didn't want him to be alone. And tonight, it let him go. They didn't talk much more. They didn't need to. They stayed together in the living room until dawn, afraid to sleep but not afraid of the dark anymore. And when morning sunlight finally touched the porch, melting the last bit of frost, the world felt normal again, like winter letting go of something it had carried too long. In the end, the newspapers never wrote about lights or voices or footprints shaped like hands. They only wrote about a young man lost in a storm. But the friends who lived it knew the truth. In the mountains, some things wander until they are found. Some echoes last long after the storm ends. And some spirits wait until dawn.